morning. Thanks for coming. I'm David Tice, the World Bank's press secretary. Dr. Kim will give brief opening remarks and then we'll turn to your questions. Small note first, if everyone could please remember to silence your phones, of course, and when we get to the Q&A, please identify yourself and your outlet once the microphone gets to you. Thanks very much. Terima kasih. Dr. Kim?
Thank you. Selamat pagi, everybody. Welcome to the 2018 IMF World Bank Group annual meetings. It's a great honor to be here. I'd like to start by thanking the government of Indonesia for their commitment to host these important meetings in the wake of the terrible tsunami and earthquake in Sulawesi. I'd like to express my sincere condolences to the families, friends, and loved ones of those who were lost. And we're also learning of further loss of life from last night's event. We're working closely with the government, and we've offered our immediate and strong support at the government's request, should it be required. Indonesia has enjoyed strong economic growth and is making significant advancements in its efforts to end extreme poverty. Indonesia's GDP per capita has risen from $785 per person in 2000 to more than $3,800 per person in 2017. And the poverty rate here has been cut nearly in half, from 19.1% in 2000 to 9.8% today. This is impressive progress, and we're confident the country can continue this economic trajectory even in the wake of the recent tragedies. By hosting these meetings, Indonesia is once again showing the world that it's a strong, resilient, and determined country. And this gathering is a clear demonstration that the international community stands with the people of Indonesia in this difficult time. These annual meetings focus on important issues facing the global economy, but too often we find ourselves focused on short-term issues. What's the impact of a rise in interest rates, a drop in commodity prices, or a shift in bond yields? These are pressing, important short to medium-term issues that we must confront. But in addition, we at the World Bank Group are focused this week on two long-term issues that are critical to every country, developed or developing, rich or poor. The first is climate change. Climate change is an existential threat to global development and efforts to end poverty. The warming planet is already having an impact on the poorest and most vulnerable. The new report from the IPCC shows that our window to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is closing rapidly. That will affect every single living creature on the planet today and long into the future. We have far less time than we thought, and there's far less action than we need. The second issue that requires countries to take the long view is human capital, the knowledge, skills, and health that people accumulate over their lives. We know that politicians in rich and poor countries alike face uphill struggles to fund better health care, put more money into schools, and make other investments in people that yield measurable dividends over time. We need to fundamentally change the urgency with which we invest in our people. That's why today we're launching a new tool to help make the case for these investments, the first Human Capital Index from the World Bank Group. We need to policies to build human capital are some of the smartest investments that countries can make to boost long-term inclusive economic growth. Right now, a quarter of the world's young people are unlikely to achieve their full potential because of chronic malnutrition and illness that results in stunting, which permanently affects a child's cognitive development, school performance, and future income. If a country's children grow up unable to meet the needs of the future workplace, that country will find itself incapable of employing its people, unable to increase its output, and utterly unprepared to compete economically. This index gives policymakers compelling evidence that delivering better outcomes in children's health and learning can significantly boost the incomes of their people and shape the direction for their countries far into the future. If we act with the sense of urgency that this human capital crisis requires, we can create a world where all children arrive at school well-nourished and ready to learn, where they have a chance to grow up and become healthy, skilled adults, and where they can be productive throughout their careers as they reach for their own dreams. That's the world we want. This index can help us get there. I'm happy now to take your questions.
Thank you. I believe there's some floating mics, but there are also standing mics, and we'll go here. We'll start with Metro TV, please.
Hi, President Kim, Andini Effendi from Metro TV. For your report, the Human Capital Index report, what's the status of Indonesia in that index, and how the economic growth and also the development can reduce inequality? And how do you see emerging markets' resilience, including Indonesia, amidst the global financial volatility? And does our macroeconomic policies are on the right path to support inclusive growth? Thank you.
So I'm trying to look at exactly what number Indonesia. Indonesia is 87th out of 157 countries, and so the actual number is 0.55 out of 1. So in other words, Indonesian children today are going to get into their 20s with only 55% of full health and full education. And so we have a very clear definition of full health and full education. You can get it from the report. But the bottom line is that into the future, the GDP is only going to be 55% of what it could be if all children in Indonesia had a full health and full education, according to the formula that we're using. Now, Indonesia is one of our early adopters. In other words, in responding to the Human Capital Index, they have decided that they're going to get out ahead of this and put on the table a transformative approach to improving human capital. So I was in Lombok, it's probably about 6 months ago now, and we visited directly one of the programs in which they're trying to dramatically reduce the rate of childhood stunting, increase access to early childhood development activities, make sure that children are well nourished and stimulated, and it's one of the best programs I've ever seen. I've been doing just this kind of work for most of my adult life. And so I can tell you that the first time I had this discussion about childhood stunting, about the issue of lack of investment in people with President Jokowi, when I first met him, he immediately responded. And since the first time I met him, Indonesia has been doing everything it can to improve its outcomes. Now, Indonesia is a country that is by law required to spend 20% of their budget, of the government budget, on education. So that's a relatively high level expenditure, over 4% of GDP. The concern that the Indonesian government has right now is that it doesn't seem that the outcomes that they're getting are consonant with the amount of money that they're spending. So we're working right now with Indonesia on improving their the outcomes from the education dollars that they spend. In terms of policies, we think that the fundamentals here in Indonesia are very solid. I have to say that we have great faith in Sri Mulyani Indrawati. She worked with me for 4 years at the World Bank Group, and we think that her management of the economy is good. I mean, there are many downside risks that we're facing now in the global economy. Trade disputes, the growth in trade has dropped from 5 to 3%, and any trade disputes that are related to China, for example, will have an impact on Indonesia. But again, we have great faith in this particular administration, especially in our good friend Sri Mulyani, and also we're extremely encouraged by how seriously they're taking the need to invest in human capital.
Great, thank you. Right here in the front, please. Is there a roving mic? You might have to go to the microphone, sorry. Oh, here it comes. Thank you. Sorry.
Good morning. My name is Obina from This Day in Nigeria. Kim, you highlighted the benefits of human capital development. And I was thinking what kind of program you have for Nigeria, where we saw last week that the number of out-of-school children has risen to 13.5 million. I also like to know the form of program you have in supporting financial inclusion in your End Poverty 2030 program. Thank you.
So again, this is why indices help us. Nigeria, unfortunately, ranks number 152 out of 157 countries. We provide quite a bit of support for Nigeria in terms of the health budget, but we feel that the overall spending on health is just far too low, 0.76% of GDP. And also, the educational outcomes in Nigeria are very, very poor. Nigeria is one of the most important countries not only in Africa, but in the world. And so we feel that it will be extremely important for Nigeria to really go on a different level altogether in terms of their commitment to investing in human capital. Many African countries are in the red zone, if you see table 2 in the Human Capital Project. Let me put it this way. I think that there is that the World Bank has to take some responsibility for having emphasized hard infrastructure, roads, rails, energy for a very long time. And that changed 20 years ago. But there has still been the bias that says, we'll invest in hard infrastructure, and then when we grow rich, we'll have enough money to invest in health and education. We're now saying that that's really the wrong approach, that you've got to start investing in your people right now, and not least of which, all the reasons why you need to do that, the rapid change in technology, the fact that many low-skilled jobs will be eliminated. Now, nobody's quite sure how long that will take, but a child born today in 20 years, almost certainly, many of the low-skilled jobs today will be gone, and the requirement for this child to be able to learn throughout his or her entire life is simply going to get higher. The requirement, the needs are going to get higher and higher. And so this is a very loud and strong message to Africa. Africa needs to invest more in health and education. Luckily, because our IDA, our Fund for the Poorest Countries, is 50% larger than it was 3 years ago. Because we have more financing, we can provide more support for African countries. But the message here is that heads of state and ministers of finance have to take responsibility. There's so much waiting for the grants to come. We'll wait, and the activists will help us, and they'll tell the donors, we need more money, we need more money. And what's happened is in many African countries, if they don't receive grant-based financing, they just simply don't spend on health and education. So we hope that this is a loud wake-up call for leaders throughout the African continent, and especially in Nigeria. Excuse me? Financial inclusion, right. So, as you know, as you may know, we have been committed to universal access to financial services by 2020. Now, we're following this very closely. Some of the concerns are that, one, we can sometimes create bank accounts, but then people don't use them. The other concern is that women still are getting financial access at a much slower rate than men, and the gap between men and women in terms of financial access remains. Now, a lot of this will have to a lot of this is dependent on improving access to broadband, for example. But we believe that access to financial services is critically important. Again, Nigeria is a country where we have a long way to go, and so we're very much focused on trying to improve access to financial services, but in a meaningful way, not just to give everybody an account, but to make sure that they can actually use those accounts in ways that will be helpful for individual families.
Right. This gentleman here.
Morning, Ricardo Leopoldo, Agência Estado in Brazil. Mr. Kim, IMF start to show, more concern about the trade tensions, even start to quantify in its predictions how would be a kind of small slowdown from the economy in the United States and China. And so I'd like to ask you, sir, what's your level of concern, and if you World Bank start to quantify and predictions forecast the problems that could cause the escalation of these trade tensions, especially for next year, and what would be the important measures that the World Bank would take to mitigate those impacts, especially to developing countries?
Well, we're very concerned about trade tensions, and in a session that we did with Roberto Acevedo, the head of the World Trade Organization, with Angel Gurria from OECD and Christine Lagarde, all four of us made very clear that trade is critical for all of our agendas. For our agenda, trade is critical because that is what has lifted so many people out of extreme poverty. We believe that increasing openness to trade in developing countries and in high-income countries, in trading with developing countries, it's been critical in the tremendous success in lowering extreme poverty. Now, we have done some projections. I can get you the numbers after the press conference. If all the countries that are involved in the trade disputes went to the limit of what WTO considers what's the right word? What the WTO would consider the limits of how serious the tariffs can be, then we'd see a clear slowdown in the economy, and the impact on developing countries would be greater. And so what we're doing right now is trying to understand exactly where our client countries sit in global value chains vis-a-vis the larger economies, especially the ones who are in the middle of a dispute. And we're trying to do everything we can to build resilience in these economies to whatever direction the trade disputes tend to go. All the countries that are in, for example, under the influence and are a part of the supply chains of China, for example, we have to think hard about what they need to do now to prepare for worsening trade tensions. So yes, we're very concerned, and we're working with every single one of our countries to prepare them in case it gets worse.
Thank you. This gentleman here, please.
In Spanish.
Okay.
Good morning, Dr. Kim. I have listened to you several times, including in Lima at the last round of meetings, and I very much appreciate the comments you've made about the Human Capital Index. We have talked a lot about, and I've heard you speak many times about the importance of sustainable development. I hail from Medellin, Colombia, and I'd like to know what you think about what will happen between now and 2030? How will things work when countries have so much to do in order to achieve the SDGs? You have spoken about the countries of Africa, but in Latin America, there is a marked degree of inequality. So what are your views on this? And also, what do you think can be done with regard to the future for Colombia, and how can we further develop our human capital? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you know, one of the things that you'll learn from the Human Capital Index is that Latin America over the past 20, 30 years has increased spending on health and education. But only in a few instances has that increased spending led to the kind of dramatic gains that we would have hoped to see. And so Latin America is one of the areas where we have to really think hard about the quality of spending, the impact that the spending is having on actual outcomes. And so the conversations we're having with most Latin American countries is it's not just about the spend, it's about how you spend it and about the quality of the education that you're getting. On the other hand, there have been some tremendous success stories. In Peru, for example, they were able to cut in half the childhood stunting rate in just 7 years. It's one of the most dramatic cases we've ever seen. And you know, in Latin America, there is a culture of community health workers, and the community health workers can play an extremely important role in improving the kind of outcomes that we're measuring for Latin America. You know, Colombia, I have to say, we're very grateful to Colombia for accepting so many migrants from Venezuela right now. And you know, I worked very closely with President Santos. Mauricio Cardenas was a good friend of mine, and I think that they laid a very good foundation for the future of the country. I think the ability to maintain the peace agreements is going to be extremely important. And I think that what happens in Venezuela and what happens with all the migrants is also going to be very, very important. We don't quite know what is going to happen in Venezuela. We're watching very carefully. But Latin America is at a really critical stage, we feel. And this focus on improving human capital outcomes very quickly has to be at the top of the agenda, because Latin America is, I think, just at the cusp of being able to, for example, create dynamic entrepreneurial economies, at the cusp of being able to use the latest platform technologies. For example, Alibaba from China, Tencent, the folks who've created these really powerful platforms to provide access to capital, access to markets. Those are the kind of innovations that I think could work very well in Latin America. But as you'll see in the Human Capital Index, despite increasing expenditures, Latin America continues to lag behind other regions.
Thank you. Right there, 3 rows back, please. Alex Bromer.
Mr. President, in your opening remarks, you said that the short term should not be allowed to divert you from the long term. But the short term looks very bad at the moment. The reappearance of debts in many of the countries which were debt relieved during the last round of problems, the build-up of non-corporate, corporate debt in many developing countries and emerging markets. Doesn't that put a crick in your program, because it means that those countries are not going to have the resources to do the human development work which you'd like to see?
Right. Thanks. That's a great question, Alex. First of all, we are very concerned about the rising debt. Low-income countries, many more low-income countries have reached the potential debt distress level in terms of percentage of GDP of sovereign debt. We are very concerned about it. Along with the IMF, we're working with every single one of our countries to manage their debt. But we have made many commitments to try to decrease the levels of sovereign debt, while at the same time pushing forward development programs. For example, our approach to maximizing finance for development, where we work very hard to try to find ways to bring in outside capital. Whenever a project is commercially viable, we have committed to, in fact, not providing sovereign guaranteed loans, but doing whatever we can to de-risk projects, de-risk entire countries, so that we can bring in the foreign direct investment that so many countries need. But there are other ways as well. So, for example, in a difficult situation, Egypt reduced its fuel subsidies. It was as high as 6.6% of GDP. They dramatically reduced their fuel subsidies and had billions of dollars then that they spent on social protection programs. We think that there are many ways of reducing unhelpful subsidies, including agricultural subsidies. We also think that that just about every developing country can get better at domestic resource mobilization, at finding ways to make sure that tax systems are fair and collect taxes from everyone. We really do feel that there's no excuse to not invest in your people at this point. And moreover, if you find an excuse not to invest in your people, it will be disastrous for you as technology begins to change the nature of work. That's in fact what the World Development Report is about. So we're not doing this just to focus on health and education. We're doing it because we think that there is a very clear connection between the Human Capital Index and productivity and growth in the economy. And so we're ready to work with any developing country to find ways of getting rid of regressive, unhelpful subsidies, for example, improving domestic resource mobilization, attracting more investment from outside the country. We think there are many ways of both investing in infrastructure and human capital while also minimizing the increase in debt to GDP ratios.
Yes, here in the front row. Thank you.
En español, por favor. Mi nombre es
I am Yolanda Morales from the El Economista paper in Mexico. President Kim, I'd like to ask you your views of Mexico in terms of the Human Capital Index, and also to hear your views on that. And with regard to the presidential elections in Mexico, the president-elect has received strong support in Congress with a strong majority. Do you think that then advantage can be taken here to undertake reforms to the benefit of the Mexican people? Thank you, sir.
So Mexico is ranked 64th on the Human Capital Index. The distance to the frontier measure is 0.61. And so again, this is why we're doing this index, because it's very easy to read. So in the future, Mexico will only have about 61% of the GDP they could have if they had full health and full education. And again, those definitions are in the book. Now, Mexico is another example of a country that has increased expenditures from 20 to 30 years ago, but the outcomes haven't been as good as we'd hoped. And so, very specifically, all of Latin America, including Mexico, needs to focus on outcomes and not inputs. Now, let me just make a point. So there are other indices that look at inputs. What's the percentage of GDP that you spend on health or education? This is completely different, right? You cannot increase your budget and get better on the Human Capital Index unless you improve your outcome, right? And so our hope is that this index will change the way we think about health and education. Up to now, and as you may know, I've been involved in this world for 30 years, what we focused on is donor generosity, put the dollars out there. And that has been extremely important. I am not at all saying that donor generosity is not important. It's extremely important. But we've not focused enough on saying, has that resulted in better outcomes? And if not, what do we need to do about it? And so, because you cannot get better on this index unless you improve your outcomes, the conversation has to change. And the question that Mexico has to ask us and everyone else it works with is, what are the things that we can do to dramatically improve outcomes? So Poland, dramatically improve their educational outcomes. Vietnam, dramatically improve their educational outcomes. And we have a pretty good idea of how that happened. Finland, over 30 years, dramatically improved their educational outcomes. China, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, all of them have had incredibly good educational outcomes. And so the question that Mexico has to ask is, what will it take to improve the outcomes? And in economic terms, we see the Human Capital Index moving us from a focus on supply and inputs. In other words, donors give more, donors give more, donors give more. We're still going to say that, to one that's demand-driven and outcome-determined. We want, when they see this, we hope that leaders will say, okay, we know we don't want to be, in the case of Mexico, 64th on the list. We want to move up that list. What will it take? And then the questions for us will be much more focused, and we are looking forward to working with the new administration and specifically helping them to improve their outcomes.
All right, thank you. We're going to have to stop after this one. I'm going to take this gentleman in the front row, and sorry, we got a late start, and we have to stop to let Madame Lagarde come in.
I learned the first term is Terry Masakoti. And as a matter of fact, when he landed here, we thought that we were coming to a country which is full of love and affection for all humanity. Everybody is smiling and trying to help. I'm a senior citizen. I have attended many annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. The first time I heard His Excellency, the President of the World Bank, there in Tokyo, and then once in Washington, D.C., when you took the job newly that time. My questions are, I represent an organization known as Investment and Marketing, Inc., from Karachi as the head office, Pakistan. My name is Hassan. I spell it as Hassan. My first question is...
we can only have one,
yes,
sorry.
Yes,
Thank you.
My first question is, what is your strategy and a policy towards globalization? Globalization. because the economy in the world,
I don't know.
the economy,
Ruralization, do you mean urbanization? Sorry.
no, globalization.
Oh, globalization, sorry, thank you.
And there has been many attempts to actually globalize not only the values, but also the economic benefits. The second question is, what is the policy towards empowerment of women in the total economic force? We feel that there have been attempts, but there has not been enough results that has come forward on the statistics. And the third,
Oh,
very
sorry,
small-
if we can keep it to 2, we really do have a hard stop, sorry.
Yeah, that's
Hassan.
all. The last one is, as a matter of fact, from Bretton Woods till today, the number of members of the World Bank are big countries, medium countries, small countries. There has been some feeling that the small countries do not get the same attention and importance as the big countries in economic terms. Thank you very much for giving me the chance.
Thank you. Well, Hassan with 2 S's. Let me say thank you for these are the most difficult and important questions, some of them that we face. So on globalization, you know, I'm an anthropologist also by training, and so I think that what's happened is there's been a globalization of trade, there's been a globalization of technology, but I think that there hasn't been a homogenization of cultures as far as I've seen. What I see, though, is that technology and advances are leading to very rapid change within countries. That cultures are changing at a very rapid pace. And so, in my view, the fact that goods and services and ideas and people move across borders is one of the great things about the world of today. So I am a globalist. It's the definition of my job, but it's also the only chance we have of ending extreme poverty. If we stop the flow of ideas, of trade, of finance, if we stop the flow of those things, we will never be able to end extreme poverty. And that's been my personal mission for most of my adult life. And so we need more trade, not less trade, in my view, which is one part of globalization. Empowerment of women is extremely important to us, and we've done it on so many different levels. We now have data on every single one of our projects on whether or not it's benefiting women. Now the next phase is to bring our gender lens to the implementation of every single project. We've done things like double the amount of procurement we're doing from women-owned firms. We started the Women's Entrepreneurship Financing Initiative, in which we're going to, we think, move $3 to $4 billion to women entrepreneurs. And we're also, we took the He for She pledge, and we're also EDGE certified, the first international financial institution. We're bringing it home. We've made very strong commitments to have equality, gender equality, in the highest ranks of the World Bank Group. And it will be difficult because there's not gender equality in the graduate programs that are the main feeders of the World Bank Group. We intend to make the World Bank Group the place that women want to go to work. And part of it is because we pay so much attention to gender equality in all of our projects. In terms of small countries, one of our most fundamental commitments is that we will leave no country behind. And so we're now looking at lots of different possibilities. For example, there are small countries, island countries, that have been devastated because of the increasing number of severe weather events. And so even if we classify a country as high middle income or even high income, if they lose 200% of GDP because of a natural disaster, it will be very difficult for them to rebuild. So we're thinking again about what does it mean to be eligible for support from institutions like ours. And this is a discussion we're having with our board, and it's all because we know that many small states, especially island states, are at increased risk for the kind of devastation that happens with the increasing number of severe weather events. We intend to leave no country behind, and our focus specifically on small states is very strong. Thanks very much, everybody.
Terima kasih. Sorry, the folks I couldn't get to.